Land changes, the tides change, the sands move, the mud moves, the trees come and die and regrow, but that's all part of the natural process that happens here.
This was a unique opportunity for research, and so that went into the designation from the outset.
I'm forever tied to it, and I watch it seasonally. I come out here as often as I can to try to just recharge.
As Cascade Head Ranch began to come together on paper, Malcolm Montague began to become extremely concerned with what this large development was going to do. He had grown up as a young man down here and was very, very well acquainted with what he believed was a paradise also. Malcolm began to talk to Wendell Wyatt, and they came up with a set of arguments to put this whole thing aside. And what they were trying to figure out was how to do that. How do you purchase this land? How do you deal with problems of condemnation of lands in the estuary? Where do you get the money to do it? How do you persuade a country to produce a designation which is unlike any other designation? And finally, Wendell Wyatt decided that he was going to put this before Congress.
It's really rare, especially in the lower 48, for the Forest Service to be tasked with the management of an estuary. And the Cascade Head Scenic Research Management Act tasked the Forest Service, tasked the CHSRA specifically in the management plan that was created as a result, to restoring this to as close to the natural processes as the Forest Service could. And fortunately, through time, there's been enough champions for this place to see that through. So the scenic side had very clear goals laid out related to scenic views and impacts to the landowners that live here. The research goals identified this place as an outdoor learning laboratory. One of the many great things about this place is the size. It's scalable. You can look at whole populations of salmon recovery like Dan and Kim have, but you can also, as the Forest Service had to, as the CHSRA National Forest had to, bite off pieces of this for restoration activity as funding was secured.
We fell into just an amazing opportunity because when we first looked at it, what we were excited about was that the Forest Service had restored a marsh every 9 years. So when the Cascade Head Scenic Research Area was set up, that protected the area from further development. But it also was established with the idea that they would be restoring wetlands to put it back to its condition prior to the construction of dikes for agricultural use. And so they took the first one out in 1978, and it took them a while, but they finally got to the next one in 1987, and then they got to one in 1996. And then there was one large wetland that had never been diked. And so we had this perfect natural laboratory. There was a wetland that was restored every 9 years, and there was one that had never been diked. And it set up this amazing natural setting to look at the rate of recovery of those wetlands and whether that made a difference in terms of their use by salmon.
So the early restoration was dike removals. They were simple in terms of restoration. You had to accept the elevation that the marsh was at, so they had subsided behind the dikes, and they had subsided to different elevations depending on how long they had been diked. So the vegetation recovery is completely different depending on how long an area is cut off from the tides and the sediments. Recovery was, for the early marsh restorations, it was just dike removal and tide gate removal, trying to put the material back where it came from. All of those sites were studied to see if the fish would come back right away, and so the fish recovery followed these restoration efforts every step of the way.
At the time that we started our work here, even though there had been studies on salmon rearing in estuaries for a long time, anyone had never looked at whether salmon use these off-channel kind of habitats in wetland channels before in Oregon. I think the big story about the Cascade Head Scenic Research Area that we've learned is that there's no magic bullet. There's not one life history or one life stage that is the problem. It's all of them. And in the case of coho, it took interventions at every single life stage to get the recovery going. Basically undoing all of the things that we had done at those life stages that had caused problems.
The later work, when we had the grant funding in place, was more complicated. Part of the funding that we were able to secure was to remove infrastructure and sites that had been altered to try to restore the natural processes. The top priority restoration element was Pixie Land. And number 2 was this place here, which was a trailer park called Tamara Keys. Another big difference is that this is from the bottom. So the Forest Service doesn't own any of the headlands of this. This is the Forest Service's ownership here under acquisitions and then the Cascade Head Experimental Forest to include this estuary. And there was a lot of belief that the restoration techniques needed to start from the top and work down to the bottom. But it's been proven with the research that's followed this work that recovery of a system, meaningful recovery even of salmon populations, can start from the bottom up. Or even just be successful to some degree only with some say in what's occurring at the bottom of the system.
The Salmon River became basically our model for how to start studying wetlands in the Columbia River estuary. Here, the largest estuary in the region by far, but no one, again, had ever looked at off-channel wetland habitats. So we basically were able to adapt the questions that we were beginning to ask, which started out first by just saying, okay, if we build it, will they come? If you restore a wetland, are salmon going to use it? But then we began asking the question, well, does it matter? If you restore it and they come, do they survive and contribute to the whole population? We could do that here and demonstrate the linkage between juvenile performance in the estuary and adult returns, survival in the ocean and returns, that we could never do in a big system like the Columbia, but we could apply those results in the way we designed our research in the Columbia, and it became very effective having both of those examples to feed off of each other.
So CHSRA is 9,000 acres, and arguably it's, again, the beating heart of this incredible small little watershed and where it meets the sea. But it's surrounded by 100,000 acres of an internationally designated area, the Cascade Head Biosphere region. So that nesting that goes on is really powerful, especially when the most important part of it, the most sensitive part of it, will be protected. So these landmark moments like 50th anniversaries really give us an opportunity to reflect on not only the past, which we can learn a lot from, and the successes, building on the successes of the past, but what is it that we want to dream about the future of one of the most beautiful, unusual places in the world? It was an experiment. It was let's try something new and radical. So this is our chance to try something new and radical. We've got to challenge ourselves to go into the unknown, especially in a time that is much different than it was in the 1970s, right? We've got planetary pressures and cultural pressures that didn't exist then. How do we address those in this place, in this time? What are we being called as a generation to step forward and do? And be bold about it to benefit not only our generation, but multiple generations to come, just as CHSRA did.